Hello, everyone. Welcome to this another monthly live session with Toast. Today, I'm very happy to be joined by Kat Savard. She's a creative director, strategic communicator that we've been working into doing some great work lately. So, welcome to this next 45 minutes, 50 minutes. We'll see where that brings us. But the idea behind this is really to kind of dig a little deeper into anything strategic, creative, with a touch of content every time, because, well, this is Toast and we're recording live here from the Toast offices. So happy for everyone to be able to join us today. So dynamics of this live session, I'll be interviewing Kat about creativity today. Kat has some notes, and we established prior for a few talking points that we'll kind of want to unpack together. So we'll be able to start away with that in a few seconds. But first, Kat, hi, how are you?
Hi, I'm great. Nice to
Beautiful.
see everybody. Even though I can't
Yeah.
see anybody, I'm assuming that they're there.
They're there, they're listening,
Awesome.
that's the whole goal behind this. So we'll have fun for the next hour. But first, I only introduced you as a great creative director and studio communicator, but I'm sure everyone's a bit curious to know a little more about you. How did you get to where you are, and what do you do?
I'm currently a consultant. I have been for quite a few years. I actually started my early career as a journalist, a music journalist specifically. I was always also interested in tech. I grew up sort of half between Quebec and half in Silicon Valley. So
Mhm.
I was kind of a very early adopter when Apple kind of furnished our schools full of computers and sort of nobody knew how to use them. So I volunteered. So I was always really interested in technology and computers. And so I started out as a music journalist, but then I also kind of started designing websites, CD-ROMs, CD-ROMs, remember those?
Oh yeah,
And
remember that.
yeah, and like really early on in my career, started just getting a lot of traction with it because nobody really knew how to do this at the time. And so I
So you did
started an
some
agency.
Shockwave and Flash and the macro
Yeah,
media times.
director. Yes, the Macromedia Suite, exactly. And I actually started an agency when I was still in university. I was like 25, and started designing websites and CD-ROMs for bands and music labels and things like that. Realized quite quickly at 25 that I was not quite ready to be running an agency or did not want to do that. So I sort of sold it to one of my biggest clients at the time and moved to Australia. And that's there actually that I decided to kind of move into advertising, specifically the digital side of advertising. That was kind
Okay.
of, back at the time when agencies had a digital arm and a traditional arm.
The early
So
years.
the early years, exactly. So I started in digital and then kind of moved into traditional because, everything got merged at some point. So I had to learn how to,
Yeah.
learn the craft of the traditional advertising TV and everything like that. And so it's sort of, yeah, it's been very organic. None of it has been super planned, but I've always kind of gone with, the things that I was interested in and the things that I was good at. So I, found my way back here to Canada eventually, and worked at Cassette for quite a few years when I
Mhm.
first moved back. And so I've throughout the years, worked in a lot of the agencies, developed some specialties in travel, tourism, some automotive, some pharma, some branding. I've always found that, I've worked on national accounts here in Quebec
Mhm.
as like a Québécoise pure laine who also did most of her, like professional years working in English and is a little bit of an outsider, having lived outside the country for a long time. I had kind of a unique perspective on, Canadian culture and Quebec culture.
Yeah.
And I found it really interesting to sell that Quebec culture to outsiders. So I worked on a lot of, tourism accounts for a long time and travel accounts.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
Oh,
yeah, I did
that's true
that.
because we could have done this in French, but we're actually doing it in English in the end. But yeah, so you got the two sides of the coin that you've worked with for a long time.
Yeah, and I think in Montreal we're kind of a unique place too, where we can, run national accounts out of Montreal.
Hmm.
Not a
True.
lot of not a lot of Canadian cities understand Quebec culture outside of Quebec, and so although there are some Quebecers kind of working outside of Quebec, I think we're in a kind of unique position to really, understand Quebec, and also, for some of us, kind of get Canadian culture. And so I've kind of always found myself working kind of on the national level here in Quebec.
And I think that this posture that we have here locally is the fact. I think that gives us a little more empathy sometimes. I don't want to say the other people elsewhere do not have that empathy, but that empathy of putting yourself in the shoes of the person you're going to be talking to, because we know that we want people sending campaigns to locally in Quebec need to have put themselves in our shoes to be able to understand how the intricacies of the market here. So I think that gives us, and the Montreal, the Montreal industry and the Montreal creative industry has that. I think.
Of course. I mean, it's, advertising is a very cultural product, right? It needs to speak to a certain culture. And I think, yeah, we're sort of in a unique place to be able to run those campaigns that are, and I've done many national campaigns that are completely different in Quebec than in the rest of Canada. And those are the ones that tend to perform better, obviously, because we're speaking to our public in a way that they will, understand.
Indeed, and that actually leads us to the reason I wanted to invite you. We it took a few months to be able to find the date, find the time, because you are one busy girl, and I'm really happy that we were able to find this time today to do this, because I wanted to talk about creativity. uh,
Mhm,
because I mentioned it in your, let's say, I think it was a LinkedIn title. I think I
mhm,
grabbed this off LinkedIn. The creative director and strategic communicator, and I wanted to kind of have this chat about the link and sometimes the dichotomy that exists between strategy on one end and creativity on the other end, because there's sometimes they're seen as being opposites, sometimes they're seen as being one needs to be in front of the other one needs to only build off the first one, strategy for example. And I wanted to talk about how you see this, and because I love your posture and your position on this, and how creativity is really something, and having the creative aspect and the creative people at the table is important throughout the entire process. So that's one of the thing. Oh, you were going to say something.
no, no, it's okay. I'm listening.
And so they're like really, and that's how we wrote the intro, and we
Mhm,
validated together about the twin engines of a also of any advertising campaign, more specifically in regards to those also content marketing campaigns. Creativity
mhm.
is very important, although strategy is too. So we outlined four things together that we wanted to unpack together, and I'll be basically simply giving you a pass easy on these aspects. And the first one is really about, let's say we put ourselves into a content strategy mindset. And really in the context of strategy, it could be strategy in general, could be applied to business strategy, could be applied to advertising strategy or branding strategy, and all sorts of strategy. But as a creative director, you've done this. How easy and how do you manage a team of creative people in the context of strategy? when everything seems that your the strategy only puts blockers, limits, and just limits creativity. How do you manage creative people that just want to be out there and have all those ideas? What's the best way to do it?
Well, I actually think that the strategy is going to get done. The strategy needs to be there. As a creative person, I need strategy, and that's actually why I started doing strategy because for me, the strategy is going to get done at some point. I would rather it get done in a strategic phase and not in a creative phase because it's a lot more involved when you get to the
Hmm.
creative and you need to be trying to work out what your message is. But I think strategy is sort of necessary, and I think most creative people actually appreciate a good strat. You have to be creative within a sandbox. You have to kind of know where you're, nowhere to work. If there's no strategy, you could do anything, and then how are you going to be able to judge whether or not your creative is good or it's on brief if the brief is vague? So for me, the strategy is sort of absolutely necessary, and I think that most creative people appreciate those, you know appreciate to have a well drawn out sandbox, and I think good strategy is also often a jumping off point for a good creative. If I'm briefing a creative team, immediately you can kind of tell if the ideas start flowing or not. And good
Right.
strategy will sort of immediately spark good ideas. Um, because it'll be directive, and I think it needs to be a little bit directive. Obviously, there's always a back and forth, right? Like
Hmm.
you get your brief, you get your message that you need to convey, and then the creative team might actually find something like really wonderful that does exactly that, or they might find something, really have a flash and find something really wonderful that's maybe a little bit adjacent, and then you can kind of you can sort of tweak, and they need to bounce off of each other. I think both need some flexibility in order
Hmm.
to do like really good work. So motivating creative teams to kind of stay on strat for me has never really been the issue if the strat is good. It's actually like a total bonus.
And when how do you involve the strategy team as if it was really
Mhm,
two opposites trying to work together? How do you integrate a strategy team in that briefing, in that brief, of course, but making
mhm,
sure that they're not putting too much downforce on the creative team?
mhm.
How do you let them? How do you let a brief allow for these adjacent ideas?
Well, I mean, I like to be involved in every step of the way. So I like to see the strat. I like to work on the strat from the outset too. Strategy is as much research as it is insight, as it is, sort of, it's a very creative act as well, right?
True.
Because you need to be making connections between things that might not have immediate connections. You need to look at, what the client wants to say, what the advertiser wants to say, but also what people want to hear, and for me, strategy is that bridge between the two, right? What's the message that people want to hear and
Hmm.
that we have to say? What's the bridge between the two? And so I think if I'm involved, usually kind of early on, I like to make sure that there's kind of enough there for the creative team. I like to maybe add a few jumping off points to kind of help them, kind of kickstart some of the idea generation. And also, I like to keep strategy involved every step of the way. I like strategy involved in creative reviews, so that perhaps the creative team will have this great idea and the strategist will flash on something that, like, they've read or they've seen in their research that they perhaps didn't include in the brief. They're like, oh, that's a really good idea because it actually touches on this other thing that I might not have told you about, but I could now kind of include as part of like why this is a good idea. So strategy can help sell the creative, and actually that's how I've always sold creative to clients. You sell them on the strategy first, and if they buy into the strategy, the strat makes sense. If the message is the right message, and then it's really only a matter of, is the creative actually presenting that message in a compelling way? That's the job of creative. The message
Hmm.
has to be clear. And then it also has to be interesting, and the interesting is often what the creative actually brings, a novel, or, it's something that's going to actually spark interest on the part of the viewer.
And how, when presenting these ideas, um, how much validation do you do with strategy to be able to really allow space for these adjacent and out of the box ideas that might bring something, but
Mhm,
still be on strat or on brief. And by that I mean, we always hear about those strategies, not strategies, but those ways of presenting where you'll present one idea that is very on brand, very very
mhm,
perfect. It checks all the boxes, but it's not the most creative sometimes. But you want
mhm.
to have that out of the box idea also. How do you balance all these to try and make a point?
Well, I mean, I think you always try and present a range, right? You always present, the best version of what everybody expects.
Mhm.
It's always pretty clear. Sometimes a client will even come at you with like, "This is what I think we should do," and I'm always open to exploring. Clients know their products really well, so I always think that there's merit in actually, hitting every target. But I also think that a good creative idea can be a little scary. In fact, some of my best ideas have been ideas that have sort of scared people a little the first time they
Yeah.
see it. When you're presenting to, and you have and your audience is sort of like smiling and maybe like kind of going, ooh, like that often is a winner for me, because that's what's going to break through in the market, right? That's the job of creatives, is to get noticed long enough, in order for you to get your message across. So if something is bland, it's not going to get noticed, and something is a little bit scary, then it might get noticed. A little bit scary to the people involved, obviously, not to the viewer, but you need to make noise. That's the first job of advertising, is to get noticed. So I do like to present a range, but obviously, like I said, strategy needs to be like along for the ride and needs to buy in. Often there's sort of, the strategist that I'm working with is the person that I'm honing my pitch on. I'm expecting them to play the devil's advocate and to kind of challenge
Mhm.
me so that I can kind of develop the idea and develop my argument for why the idea actually does fit the brief, and for why the idea is actually a good one. So I think going into present an idea, you need everybody to be on board.
That's true. That's true. So speaking of presenting an idea and having everyone on board, it starts with a good brief. What makes a good brief in the end? How does the strategy, where does strategy stop and creativity
Mhm.
start? So up to where do you have to go in terms of strategy? How do you envision that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, strategy starts at the very beginning.
Yes,
Starts at the
the
client
beginning we
brief.
all know where it is. It's
Yeah,
mostly
it
that
starts at the client
junction
brief.
between the two, that
Yeah,
messy middle.
yeah. I mean, it is a messy metal, but the creative process is necessarily messy. It's not linear. You go through the many phases of grief. You go through that. I'll never get this, and then you have a flash, and then you develop it, and then somebody shoots it down, and then you have another one. Like it's a zigzaggy sort of way. And I think strategy, like I said, needs to be kind of along for that ride, trusting the process, but along for the ride. But to get back to like what it takes to get a good brief, I mean, it's really simple. It's a clear message. Obviously it needs to be on brand. That's kind of the default for any
Mhm.
communication, for any commercial communication. But it really does need to be a simple, clear, ideally single message, even though you can have, a couple of secondary messages if you've got the time to get them through. And so creative team just need a good message. They need a good message that sort of makes sense and sparks some ideas. They need time. Obviously we work, we work in timelines, and creativity is great. It's never done. It's never perfect. We're always going to
Mhm.
try and, get as much time as we can to kind of, hone the product and perfect it. It's not necessarily budget. It's actually really brief and time. For me, those are the kind of two things that I look for in order to get like a good creative product, and a motivated team, motivated creative team, and understanding what motivates a creative team. Um, you know um, creatives are sort of judged by their book, right? That's our currency.
Yeah. Mhm.
And so, the ability for them to learn new skills, it's as much conceptual as it is craft. Sometimes coming up with a good idea is one thing, but actually like seeing that idea through to completion, is a whole nother set of skills. And so giving a creative team ownership of their idea, ownership of that, of the process, um, allowing them to present their work, um, and just, giving them the ability to work on stuff that's going to stretch their muscles and build their book. Like that's what they're looking for.
So you mentioned the good brief having a single message, or at least a
Yeah.
very limited number of messages. What else do you like to see in a brief? What helps the creative crew of
Hmm.
the or the same people that put the creative hat a day later?
Yeah. Well, often one thing that I will add to a creative brief is just a series of jumping off points. The message will be, I don't know, we're selling a bicycle with, like, two wheels, and the unique thing about this bicycle is that it's red. And then, so the message is very clear. Then often what I will do is I'll do a little bit of brainstorming to just try and give the creative team a few jumping off points that they can then sort of explore. It could be, and like really like coming up with this like on the fly here, but like this bike is on fire. Like, is that a good jumping off point? And so it's not a fully fleshed out ideas, but it's like five or six. So the tremplin, like we would say in
Yeah.
French, like a real, just a jumping off point. I found that to be really helpful. I try not to be too directive as a creative director. I don't
Mhm.
want it to be my ideas that are going through. I want it to be the creative team's ideas, and I'm there to kind of help them. With the benefit of removal, I'm not so close to the ideas. I can kind of, like, I'm not developing them, and so I have the benefit of recul, as we say in French.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, but I find sometimes giving them some jumping off points can be really helpful for them, and I find that it for creative teams, at least, when those jumping off points are coming from a creative director, it's often a little easier to work on than if they're coming from a strategist, because I've already started essentially the conceptual process for them.
You gave him a little kickstart to
A
start
few
thinking.
paths.
Yeah.
Yeah, a few paths. Yeah.
And how do you define, once that brief goes to the through the creative process,
Hmm.
where does it end? How do you end it, other than say they need it by Friday? How do you kind of coach the
Yeah.
creative minds of the team to,
Hmm.
you know what, it's never going to be perfect, but at some point you'll have to
Hmm.
stop? How do you coach a team like that for that?
Well, I think it's just, setting up a timeline. Like everybody else, we're working under deadlines, and we do have to get it done by Friday a lot of the time. And so it's just, setting up a certain amount of time. Usually it's, you try to spend the bulk of your time in creative iteration. So I'll give them a couple of days. We'll meet again for a creative internal. Often we'll have, 10 different ideas, and then together we kind of whittle those ideas down to the ones that we feel are probably, have the most legs, as we say,
Hmm.
and the most potential. We might whittle 10 down to like five, and then they'll go further refine those five ideas, and then we'll whittle them down to, the ideas that we feel, are the ones that we want to present, and then we go into, we keep sort of fine tuning them as we go. But I think it's sort of a natural process. As you kind of refine the ideas, you find that some of them have potential and some of them kind of just naturally fall out. And sometimes you just have to make a choice. You can't present them all, right? So you have to really kind of go with your best ideas.
That's the hard part, making choices.
That's the hardest part, I find, for young creatives, and it's the hardest thing to do for your own ideas. But that's why the universe invented creative directors, because it is literally our job to kind of help, make decisions. It's really hard to kill your babies, as they say. You love all of your ideas and you're very attached to all of them, and so I unfortunately have to become the bearer of bad news sometimes, and sort of, come in and say, well, these are the three that we're going to go forward with. But often it's a decision that's really made, alongside the creative team.
How so? And we always get at some point a mandate, a client, a project. Sometimes, either if you're on the agency side or client side or wherever you need to have your creativity flow, there comes some boring stuff. how
Mhm.
let's say you have a long run of boring stuff that you know are going to be coming up, like a 3 month of less creative things. How do you keep the creative team motivated? How do you keep those neurons really still up and running for the next time the real creative juices will be needed?
Mhm. Well, I think that there's a benefit there if you're in a, if you're in an agency that has several clients to, variety is the spice of life, for everybody, including creative people. And so I think, and also I think being honest about, hey guys, like we're gonna have to be writing, I don't know, emails for the next 2 months, and you know, that's the thing that we're gonna do. We're gonna do the best possible job that we can at those emails. And so I think that there's always something interesting to be done with any piece of communication. And I really do mean that. I don't think that there is, there are some projects that are a little bit more repetitive, but those tend to be more on the production side of things. I always think that there's an opportunity to kind of, flex a creative muscle and do something interesting. If you're approaching the project from the start going, oh, like another, another promo email, but you can also challenge yourself to like, how can I make this different than the way that I've made it before, and honestly, I find, at least personally, the subject matter, and it's always great to work on a brand with a product that's like sexy and fun and new and
Mhm. Yeah.
somehow innovative. um, but I also think that there's opportunity in everything. There's I've worked in environments, especially in pharma environments, where your sandbox is this big,
Yeah.
and
Legally.
there's
It's not
still there.
even because it's
Yes.
boring, it's just legally it's
No,
that
it's
big.
heavily regulated. Exactly. You're speaking in metaphors. There's no product to show, so you're gonna show a pill. So I think that but there's always opportunity to kind of find something and do something interesting with it. So I personally, I'm not someone that's very easily bored in life, because I think you make the project what you want to make it. And there's always something to be found, something to learn. Yeah.
I liked how by mentioning the email example, the promo email
Hmm.
example, yeah, either from a copywriting standpoint or even maybe a visual or design standpoint, you brought us on the turf a little more of content in a way.
Yeah.
And one of the thing I often see or that I kind of have to expect is that very often a content strategy will be done at some point in time, and then
Hmm.
it will run for a year and a half. That
Hmm.
same strategy will be used, or that same strategy document, those same insights will be used
Hmm.
for almost a year or a year and a half. How or what needs to be in the strategy, or what needs to be in the creative direction or creative management, so that at some point you don't run out of ideas? Because I mean, you get an insight at one point, all these great ideas come out during the first initial weeks or so, you really got your neurons firing on all cylinders and so on, but there comes a point where there's no more ideas. How is this the proper way to do it, or is there a better way to do this? Because that's something we see very often.
I don't believe that we're ever going to run out of ideas, honestly. They've been advertising the Big Mac for how many years now, and they still find new ways to advertise the Big Mac. So I think that that's where creativity really, is really actually all the more important, is finding new and new ways to say the same thing over and over again. That's that's the challenge. That's the challenge for creatives. But honestly, I've rarely come across, an account or a message that couldn't be said in about 50 different ways. Um, it's also the reason why creatives, tend to move around a little bit more
Hmm.
than perhaps, more kind of account minded or strategy minded people. There's a lot of benefit in knowing your product in depth when you're a strategist. I think as a creative, there's a threshold you have to meet. You have to really understand what it is that you're talking about. But also, there's also a lot of benefit in fresh blood, and in moving around, and in having approaching something from a different perspective. So yeah, I don't believe that creativity runs out. We're always going to find a way.
Oh, but it's I love your analogy, or actually the actually true use case of the Big Mac, because there comes a point sometimes where we're at the ideation phase with clients and with brands, and where really we got the insight, we got the content pillars we need to focus on, which would be equivalent to the messages that you mentioned. Because this is the three things we want to talk about in our
Hmm.
content platforms. There comes a point when those post-its on the wall just get leaner and leaner, and there's less and less. We've kind of covered everything we thought we could cover on those content pillars, and we're not yet ready as a team to redo or rework on the strategy.
Hmm.
And I think that's one of the challenges that copywriters or videographers or really people that usually have these ideas for content find hard and stumble upon through time. And there comes a point where we really have the feeling that, oh, we've done everything. I don't see how we
Hmm.
can talk about, I don't know what, exterior planters for tomatoes, and we've covered them from left, right, up, down. We put them on fire, even, like I said, and
Hmm.
we just don't know what to say anymore. But still, the brief is the same. We're selling the same product, and the audience has the same problem, so the insight is similar. So this is sometimes something that is really hard to get over and really start a new round of creative stuff. I like the idea that you mentioned, is that having new blood on the account, new blood on the team, that just brings something that maybe the other people were stuck in their own little sandbox and were looking really at the sandbox next door and see how they were doing things. But
Hmm.
it really is a challenge to kind of keep the creativity flowing through time.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, and
I think that
Go ahead.
it's funny, I don't know why I'm thinking of this, but my brain is immediately going to, I don't know if you remember that series called Will It Blend? They had a
Oh
blender,
yeah,
right? They had a really good blend. I don't remember what it was called. Um, they kept this
Blend Tech,
going for
Blend
years.
Tech,
Blendtec,
yeah,
of
Blend
course,
Tech,
the
the
most boring
blender. It was
name.
this guy
Yeah,
in the sarro, in the white sarro, and the
yeah, yeah. And you would shove anything in that blender to see if it would blend. It's the same idea over and over and over again, and yet people are watching to see if the iPhone, like, 12 will blend, And so I think that there's something to be done, and really just changing up the execution. The message is exactly the same, the strategy is exactly the same, production values, everything is the same, and yet extremely popular as a series. So I think
yeah.
that there's ways when you think your content not as a single proposition or a single execution. If you're thinking, how can we make a series out of this? Every content creator worth their muster online is doing just that. They've picked their niche and they've found every possible angle to keep talking about that niche. So I think that there's always a way.
And I like what you mentioned about the series aspect of it, because one of the things we do in our content strategies is actually to build those content pillars, which I kind
Hmm.
of do, kind of link to the messages we're talking about. And then under that, as kind of kickstarters to the creative process, we kind of figure out right away a few series that could be done. Something we
Yeah,
know that, as you mentioned, has legs, could be done either 5, 10, 15, 20 times, just slightly different, to kind of
yeah.
cover an angle for the audience that wasn't covered yet. And so those series are a way to, that's very true. Those series become a way to kind of put some guardrails on the creativity for the ideas, but still
Hmm.
staying on brand, still staying on strat, still staying on brief. And I think those often bring really, really good ideas. You have a great point there.
If you have a good premise, it can be replicated. And also keep in mind that the way that people are watching content or watching whatever it is that you're making, it's not linear. They're not going through every single one of them.
Yeah.
They pop into, they pop into your media universe at some point. And you're like, oh my God, they're still doing that. They're still blending stuff. Like, I wonder what
Are
they're
they
blending this
really?
time. So I don't know. I don't know. I'd have to look it up. But I think that, yeah, you sort of, it might feel very repetitive to the team working on it, but it
Mhm.
certainly usually does not. to the audience, you know. And I think that there's actually a lot of benefit to having a series and to having to kind of creating those moments that are, you know, that are replicable and that become kind of familiar, you know, because that's what's got, like, one great piece of content is awesome, and if you go viral with it, amazing. um, but I think that there's also, you know, there's a lot to be said for the strategy of kind of like sticking with something, even if it feels extremely repetitive to you, it won't to the audience. It's so fractured out there. You know, you're going to be one blip, and you might come back with a similar blip in 2 weeks, and that's perfectly okay. It's actually kind of a
You
good thing.
you raise such a great point. And funny thing, we were talking about empathy a few minutes ago, and
Mhm,
one of the things that we need as production teams and creative teams to remember is that the audience that we're going to be speaking to, that we are engaging with, has not seen everything we've done. They've
mhm.
never seen everything that the brand
And
has
they
done
never
yet,
will. Yeah.
and they never will. So
Yeah.
it could be that great new initial spark for that consumer or that stakeholder, and that's actually the entry point for that person. So
Hmm.
although it seems like it's not as creative as it could be, for the audience it is. So
Hmm.
that's also the definition of creativity can be seen from two point of views: from the creative team's point of view, which is it's never going to be creative enough,
Hmm.
or from the audience's point of view, where everything is new and it is in many cases potentially creative enough.
Hmm.
But managing that can be hard because you want to have the most creative people having the most creative ideas when they are needed, but it's not always the most creative stuff that they feel they are doing. Although on the other side of the screen, it could be, it can, and it might be.
I'm sure
Um,
whatever creative team made those Will It Blend videos had a really good time, you know,
yeah,
finding
the
the
first
next thing, you
56
know?
times, but I
Yeah,
mean, when up to 100, they were
of
like,
course.
okay,
And
let's
then
blend another
perhaps you
one.
don't need a creative team on it anymore. Perhaps at that point you're really just doing prod, you know, and that's okay, you know?
Mm. Oh, that's interesting. So there comes a point maybe when the creative team is not necessarily
Of course.
anymore or essential, and it's just craft. Let's craft
Of course.
those what was created. Let's craft that until we've kind of juiced it all the way.
Of course, and I'm seeing this a lot right now, you know, with a lot of my clients that are, most of my clients are direct clients, you know, and so they don't have an agency, or they have an agency, and then they're working with people like me that are, you know, consultants, directly, and I find that, you know, there's a great need for kind of an initial spark, right? An initial kind of
Mhm,
like setup of creative resources, of creative ideas, whether or not it's, you know, whatever it is, you know, they need to kind of, you know, up their social media game, and they need a system that they're then going to be able to run in-house, you know. So often, you know, people like me are kind of brought in sort of at the start to kind of get things rolling, and to kind of like coach the team, and to kind of get the ball rolling, and to kind of set the tone a little bit, and then they bring me back in on a kind of as needed basis, you know.
mhm,
But they've got, you know, they've got teams in house that are more kind of like craft focused, and they're more focused on the day-to-day running of things. And so I think that, you know, especially since the pandemic, I think you've seen a lot of people kind of, you know, um, look at how they're getting, you know, how they're getting their assets done. And obviously most brands are not equipped to be doing some heavy production side of things, you know.
yeah.
But for light stuff, and that's why, you know, that's why people like me and people like you are still sort of necessary and in business. But I think that there's yeah, sometimes not, you know, you don't need a full creative suite of teams. You need
Mhm.
them at the beginning. You know, you need those initial ideas, and then you can kind of take off with the craft and the production.
And we often hear also people that say, "Oh yeah, but we're not creative. So if you leave
Mhm.
us to try and be creative, we won't be." But we all know for a fact that in the end, every team is creative in its own way,
Of
and
course.
I think the key behind this is for the managers, the director, the team leads, the leaders to be able to get those sparkles and sparks that come from the team, be able to isolate it and say, okay, we've got a creative idea here. Let's nurture it and let's bring it
Hmm.
somewhere, because
Hmm.
everyone can have ideas. It's not
Of
necessary.
course.
There are people that are specialized, like you and the people you work with. They're specialized in keeping the wheels running and have all sorts of new ideas. But anyone can bring a great idea to the table, and then be the question is how is making sure that it's well executed, it's kept, it's nurtured, it grows into something valid
Hmm.
that is interesting, and then crafted. It doesn't need to be a dedicated creative team either.
Of course. Yeah, I really do think that a good idea can kind of come from anywhere. I also think that like a final piece of communication is perhaps like, you know, 25% inspiration and like 75% perspiration or whatever you want to call it, you know. So yeah, it's a lot. The decisions have to be made all along the way, you know, from deciding what idea we're going to run with to,
Hmm.
you know, every piece of, you know, craft and design and, you know, production decisions that you have to make along the way. And you know, you need very different talents to kind of get, you know, to get something out there. So I think that, yeah, the capacity to do that is actually given to a lot of people, you know. But there are, I still do believe that there's, you know, there's professionals, there's people that, you know, there's people that do production for a living,
Yeah,
you know, that are often the best place to kind of, you know, to get that production out the door in a way that's going to be compelling.
that's very true. Earlier you mentioned having that out of the box idea that really might make a dent in the market, make it
Hmm.
different than the other stuff that's been
Yeah.
done, make it memorable. In a way, that's starting to putting the finger on the fact that sometimes creativity brings better results. How? Because one of the things we get asked a lot, of course, is to demonstrate the ROI of
Hmm.
what everyone does,
Hmm.
and that's more and more a reality for CMOs, for VPs of marketing, comms, and so
Hmm.
on. Is to try and demonstrate the reason why there's so much effort being put behind every asset that's crafted and created
Hmm.
and produced. How how would you go about making the case to explain how creativity drives better results? Maybe not ROI from
Hmm.
an Excel sheet, or can it?
It
But
should.
how
It
it
should.
should.
Yeah.
There is an impact, but without necessarily going into how to measure it, how do you make the case for the importance of creativity in the
Well,
results?
I think creativity is what allows your message to cut through. You know, you can have the best message to get across out there. If you're doing it in a boring way, nobody's going to be listening. You know, I think it really does come to, you know, attention fragmentation. People are, you know, you're not going to get noticed. You're just not going to get noticed unless your idea is presented in a compelling way. And that's what creative really does best. You know, the bicycle is red doesn't make for a very interesting communication. The bike on fire could get you to notice the bike, you know. So I think it's, you know, to go back to like the simplest of analogies, you know. And so, and I think that one thing that's, you know, you talk about ROI, and that's one place where I have like perhaps a little bit of a gripe with our industry at the moment, is that things are immensely measurable, especially, you know, everything that's digital. And I
Mhm.
think often the results of our communication doesn't tend to get back to the creative team. And I think that that's the thing that I'm often missing, is how did that do? You know, I want to know how my work did out in the market. And sometimes we don't always get that information, or it's not complete. And I think that that's something that would be really helpful for, you know, for creative teams and for all, you know, like marketing and content teams actually, is to really kind of see how those pieces of communication that we created really
Right.
measured up in market, you know. Because that's how we get better, that's how we learn, you know. I'm always surprised at the stuff that did really well. You know, I remember running ads. God, it was I'm not going to talk about like what brand it was, but we purposely downgraded our design because we felt like maybe a cheaper looking banner ad would work better, and like, you know what, it did. for
Oh
that
wow.
particular brand. We kind of let go all of the great design skills, and we had amazing art directors on this account, and we sort of specifically directed them to make a banner ad that looks worse, and it's a little pixelated, and perhaps
Mm.
it's just, it just looks a little cheaper. And for some reason it worked. We all didn't love it, but it was a real challenge for them actually to make an ad that looked, a little bit amateurish, and for that brand it worked. So
Uh,
it's always surprising.
Without saying who, was it in pharma?
No.
No? Okay, because I've
No.
seen this trick in,
Yeah.
in pharma lately. There's one brand that does it. It's really very
Yeah.
pixelated, but you
Yeah.
know that it's on purpose because there's part of the banner that's not at all.
That's not.
And it just looks weird from when you look at it from a
Yeah.
design standpoint. So I was just wondering if that was it. And that's
No, it
that,
wasn't.
that one's
But
it.
but again, I think, imagine me going to an art director who's, very skilled at their job and asking them to purposely do a badly designed, banner ad, like a whole series of them, you know. Again, they ended up loving it because it was a real challenge for them. They'd never had to do that before. So they have to find a way to kind of purposely downgrade and like save and save again, and just like, bring down bring down that little lever that
The
makes,
JPEG quality and
yeah, exactly. And also, move some stuff around so that, the fonts were a little bit off and everything just looked a little bit weird, and strangely it worked. And so that was really fun for the creative team. It turned out to be a really fun exercise because they're like, how ugly can we make this and still have it work? And
oh, I
so
love it.
yeah, there's yeah, always surprising at what works. And so getting those results and getting a bit of insight into the ROI of our work is always like super helpful for creative teams.
I see the time running. There's one thing. There's one elephant in the room that we hadn't discussed before when we prepared this, but the whole notion of, it's very cliche to talk about it. The notion of AI,
Hmm.
the notion of how AI could impact either the creative process or the creative output.
Hmm.
These days, I talk about AI in a way that I compare it to stock photography in a way. And the fact
Hmm.
that what stock photography does is try to find, basically in history, is find, okay, I think this is going to be needed by someone. It's like an
Hmm.
average of potential needs. So I'm
This
going to
is the
create this.
generic version of that thing.
Here's
Yes.
the generic version of
Hmm.
someone coming off a cab looking
Hmm.
like a business person.
Hmm.
Here it is. And stock photography has always looked like stock photography in
Hmm.
most cases. I remember when we got them on CDs. Remember that? You'd buy the CD and so on. But these days, I see AI content and creative output as being
Hmm.
exactly that. It's
Yep.
actually as if it was stock content that at
Hmm.
some point you might be seeing on another brand's
Yeah.
assets also.
Hmm.
How do you see this down the road? And second question, how do you use it currently, and how do you see teams use it properly
Hmm.
currently in the current state in January
Yeah.
2025?
I mean, I'm using it constantly. I'm whether it's ChatGPT or Claude or Perplexity, I'm kind of using all of them for very different reasons. Um, but I do see it as it's the first bad ad, like often it's
Mm,
the first like basic draft that you would do with your eyes closed. And then it's a lot easier to look at a page that's filled out than a blank page. And so often it's by looking at the first generic version that like whatever ChatGPT spits out for you that you can kind of see, oh, okay, this is all wrong. But at least it's out there and now I can make it better. So it's a real jumping off point. I'm finding it very useful for certain things, for, whether it's like drawing up, a storyboard for something that you're going to shoot. Um,
mhm.
it's never perfect. Recently I just couldn't get it to. I wanted to put a snowmobile in a garage, and then it kept putting snow on the floor. It just wasn't. It just sort of wasn't understanding. So it's not perfect, but it's a good sort of jumping off point, and it's a good start. It'll never be final creative,
It's your red
but it
bike on
is
fire.
exactly, exactly. do me a red bike on fire. And so that'll help me sell the idea, but it certainly wouldn't be what finds its way out to, to communication that's client facing,
Yeah.
that you would shoot and that you would get an artist to do like a really great job at. So I think that, yeah, it's super useful. I don't, far be it for me to say where AI is going, but it's certainly not at the stage now where it's creating anything that's new enough, because that's what creative is, right? It has to be
Yeah.
novel.
Yeah.
And that's what the AI doesn't do with novel. It does an amalgamation of everything that's been done before, and it's not doing novel yet. So I think that, we're still safe, we're still in business.
But then again, and it becomes very philosophical, but in a way, I've always kind of perceived also creatives in more general sense as being
Mhm.
people that have been inspired by so many things and then have that creative output, which is what the AI people are saying. Well, it's being inspired by so many things and it's kind of spitting out something. It's kind of the same process, but it doesn't work yet. Will it? I don't know,
Oh,
but
I think we're inspired by a lot of things, and what our goal is to do none of those things. Is to do the
hmm,
thing that is, of course, inspired by, but in a new way. And that's the leap that I'm finding right now that AI is not necessarily doing. It's doing the amalgamation and it's doing the approximation of all of those things that have been done before. Whereas the job as a creative is to, yes, consume a lot of content, consume a lot of culture, and assimilate it, find what you want out of it, but then come up with something new based on what you've seen. So it's almost quite the opposite, to
hmm.
look at what's been done and to specifically not do that. That's what we're all trying to do anyway.
Amazing, amazing. Kat, we'll have to wrap this up. It's been almost an hour. Thank you so much for the time on this session. Always so fun speaking with you. Um,
Pleasure.
if anyone wants to connect with Kat on LinkedIn, is a good place, I guess.
Yeah. I also have a
So
website, catsavard.com. Very easy to remember.
indeed. And well, I'll make sure that I hope a lot of people connect with you because you have an amazing mind, an amazing creative mind. It's always a pleasure to speak. So for everyone, if there's anything, either hook up with Kat, hook up with me, let's connect and let's talk about creativity or anything else that's up on your mind. So Kat, again, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Have a great day, everyone, and we'll see you next time for another live session here at Toast.